NGOs like Oxfam, Save the Children, World Vision. Expatriate aid workers in the developing world employ maids, nannies, security guards, drivers, gardeners, sometimes cooks. And I wrote this book because although nearly every expat aid worker in the developing world has local people working within the intimate sphere of their homes, these relationships are seldom, if ever, discussed in analysis of the development paradigm or its praxis. And ethnographers of development for a long time have insisted that policy is not made in the tidy offices of experts, but becomes what it is during implementation. And I contend that this includes the way that expat aid workers live, play, and solicit paid care in their overseas posts. So again, drawing on a long history and feminist theory about the personal being very political, right? That there's no difference between the domestic sphere and politics. So my book addresses this omission through an ethnographic analysis of the intersection of development work and domestic work, drawing on multiple years of participant observation in Dakar, Senegal, the capital of Senegal, in West Africa over the past 2 decades, as well as 5 years of digital ethnography, which I can talk a little bit more about if there's interest, in expat and aid worker online spaces, and a core of 36 interviews with aid workers and also with the domestic workers of aid workers, conducted in Senegal between December 2016 and January 2019. The aid worker interviews were conducted in French, Italian, and English, and the domestic worker interviews were conducted in French and Wolof, which is one of the major languages of Senegal. And then also, of course, more informal interviews with other expats, with Senegalese who work in and around the development industry, and with development workers who are now posted back in their home countries. So like other employers of domestic workers, expat development workers as a class are dependent on the reproductive labor of a portion of the global lower class for the reproduction of their own status. As I show in the book, aid workers' migration to the field and their employment of cheap domestic labor gives them the means for increased status, for financial well-being, and an enhanced work and family balance. In this way, I classify them as economic migrants. Although race and colonial legacy often prevents scholars and governments and lay people from categorizing expatriates from the West to the developing world in this manner. Although I should say that there's a great new book that just came out this year by Sarah Kuntz about expatriates that tracks it as a migration category. It's a really great addition. But usually expats are, usually we fail to include expats in the category of economic migrants. And the fact that there are so few studies of them, that even by organizations that track migration really closely, like the IOM and the OECD, to me says a great deal about our understanding of whose mobility should be disciplined and controlled and who should have unfettered access to mobility. So although much work on migration and domestic service is about south-north migration, the migration of care workers themselves, that the employers in this case are the international migrants and that the employees are the local citizens ultimately does very little to upset the global social order of the International Division of Reproductive Labor. The servants of globalization, to use Russell Perennis's term here, are generally the same demographic, the Black and brown women of poorer countries. So Arlie Hochschild has used the metaphor of extraction in her work about the migration of care workers, the global care chain, drawing a parallel between the imperialist extraction of resources like gold and rubber and the current migration of care workers from the developing world to the West to do caring labor for lower cost. I too deploy this metaphor when thinking about aid work. And this is the crux of it for me, that spotlighting the outsourcing of cheap reproductive labor, the extraction of care that occurs so regularly in the practice of international development work, is, I think, an invitation to identify the other multiple ways that the ostensibly giving industry of development is an extractive industry as well. My studies focus on the care work of local people for expatriate aid workers. So the rewards it brings for the expats and the sacrifices and ambivalent opportunities it entails on the part of domestic workers is just a way to flip the script on facile representations of Western aid workers coming to help, right? Emphasizing instead the extracted labor of local people that upholds the development industry. So today I want to talk about just one aspect of the book, and that is how aid workers themselves reckon with the contradictions between their understanding of their own position as altruists seeking to uplift the poor, and on the one hand, right, and being bourgeois expats who profit from the cheap domestic labor of the poor on the other hand. This is an uncomfortable contradiction to sit in. To use the words of Ana Ramos Zayas, how I want to explore how these aid workers, quote, inhabit their privilege and strive to make ethical and moral sense of social and racial inequalities that are inherently immoral. So expat aid workers often have ambivalent feelings about the domestic work that they purchase and those who perform it. For European and American aid worker employers especially, although they generally express relief and appreciation for the luxury of having staff, which is often how it's phrased, they also feel embarrassment, guilt, and discomfort about hiring people to do their domestic labor. Taking advantage of their relative wealth and privilege to outsource the low status work in their home and paying rates far below what they themselves would accept as a living wage in their own country does not fit with their perception of their purpose as aid workers in Africa. Though other forms of Western economic migration to Africa, including mining or private industry, produce and exploit the same labor pool, there's no inherent paradox between their industry's raison d'etre and their impact. Aid workers, however, have devoted their careers ostensibly to an industry whose stated aim is to improve well-being and increase prosperity around the globe. How can they then reconcile this mission with the personal perks and wealth extraction that they collect from the industry? How can they be at ease when their salaries are so far superior to those around them? When the opportunity to wash their dishes and empty their rubbish appears advantageous to many. Enjoying the fruits of the power and wealth disparities between their home nation and their host nation is potentially disturbing and distressing to the aid worker and has to be reframed so as to keep consistent their self-image of being on the right side of global justice. The inequities of race and nation that fuel their career opportunities are not only all around them in their overseas posts, but are brought directly into the home through locally purchased domestic service. The home becomes a transnational contact zone where they can't escape the realities of the wealth and opportunity gap between themselves and local people and the fact that they are capitalizing on them. So aid workers, in what I found from doing this ethnographic research, is that aid workers react in particular ways to deflect, to ease, or subvert the discomfort of sitting in this privilege. In the book, I explore 3 such strategies, 2 of which I'll just mention today briefly, and the third I'll discuss in more detail. The first is to recast their employment of domestic workers as a duty, as an obligation, akin to kind of a white man's burden, to be a job creator and to provide income opportunities, however meager, for local people. So as Jillian, the regional director for a faith-based INGO said, it's kind of like this mixed thing. You feel like, especially in American culture, you know, I can do it all by myself. We're independent. We don't have people to clean for us. But at the same time, it's also this, okay, it's actually a good opportunity. And that's where you feel good about it. You're like, okay, I make a pretty good living. And so it's kind of this mixed thing. So rather than sitting in the feelings of that discomfort at outsourcing aspects of life maintenance that could ostensibly be done for oneself, Jillian and others reframe their role as one of job creators and thus could feel good about it. Turning the purchase of cheap domestic labor into a kind of noblesse oblige is a deft way to displace guilt and discomfort about privilege and the outsourcing of reproductive labor. Indeed, the narrative of an obligation to intervene for the good of the other is part of the depoliticization of poverty that characterizes the international development industry. It goes without saying that that philosophy of the burden to help the less fortunate is also and continues to be used as a justification for all other kinds of imperial intervention as well. The second strategy to minimize discomfort is to make a concerted effort to be a good or a nice boss. This can mean striving for emotional closeness with domestic staff, or being low key and not demanding, trying to create the image of horizontal power relations in the household, or even going to great lengths to avoid firing them when unhappy with the quality of their work, which is something that came up often, especially with American bosses. By fixating on the details of being a nice person, aid workers are able to de-emphasize the power differentials in their understandings of these relationships and avoid acknowledging the ethical structural issues that shape their employment of local people to work in their homes. In other contexts, researchers have shown that employers of domestic workers deploy personalism as a way to, quote, reduce class boundaries and alleviate their class guilt. I'm quoting from Alvarez Tinajero. And having friendly relations minimizes the social separation and allows the employer to imagine that the employee is an equal and not in a position of subordination. Aid workers I interviewed wanted their employees to walk a particular line of being comfortable, but not too comfortable in their homes. Several aid workers told me of firing maids, not because the cleaning wasn't done to their satisfaction, but because the maid didn't make chit-chat or seem relaxed enough in the home to minimize the discomfort of the social distance between employer and employee, thereby ruining the illusion of friendly equality that a more sociable relation could help maintain. Yet I also heard stories of maids being fired for too much familiarity and comfort. One aid worker returned home to find his housekeeper entertaining her own guest in his home, which he said felt like kind of a violation. Another aid worker told of a colleague who saw her on her maid's Facebook page that the maid was wearing her hat and taking selfies. She said, it was not like this was just a hat laying out, she said with an air of scandal. It was something put away. So, and again, these two cases display what my aid worker interlocutors saw as clear violations of the boundaries that domestic workers should respect. Boundaries that were doubtlessly never articulated to the domestic worker explicitly. In both cases, the maid was fired. So much of the feminist literature on the feelings of care work explore these fraught issues of being close, but not too close, right? This is a dynamic that we see throughout literature about employing domestic work or intimate labor. Whereas the condescension of care for the poor in development is usually framed as paternalism, the condescension of care for domestic servants is usually cast as maternalism. Maternalism is characterized by an obfuscation of the economic relationship between domestic workers and their employers by portraying it as a familial relationship. Employees are treated like members of the family, and we see this across studies of domestic work, right? But they're treated as members of the family selectively and in ways that are usually controlled by the employer. In this context, in which the employers are also aid workers, there is a mix of both this paternalistic ideas of development and maternalistic approaches to treating house staff. Scholars of domestic work are clear that even well-intentioned maternalism is a site of uneven power relations that can heighten the structural asymmetries of the employment relationship, weakening the employee's negotiating position in terms of wages and conditions, as any attempt to improve these is an insult to the family. Right? You're doing this job just for money. We thought it was that you loved our son and that's why you want to be the nanny, right? You're part of the family. How can you insult us by claiming rights as a worker? So being part of the family is a conditional and contingent in such a conditional and contingent manner can make domestic workers more vulnerable rather than less vulnerable. The obfuscation of the employment relationship is entirely contingent. When employers wish to assert the lack of familial obligation they have to these non-familial household members, they have the power and the authority to do so. Okay, so the third way that aid workers deal with their ambivalent feelings and discomfort about employing household help in their overseas post is to bring additional transactions into the relationship beyond paying them directly for their domestic services. These include paying for additional training, supporting the workers' families financially, giving career and financial advice, giving monetary and material gifts. Aid workers code these transactions as charitable, in ways that help them avoid thinking of this extra investment as compensation for what they know are extremely low wages. Instead, using care as an idiom for these gestures of financial support, it puts them in the position not as exploiter of cheap labor, but benevolent patron or mentor. Thereby, this site of their exploitation of a labor reserve created by poverty can itself be reframed as their own efforts to develop or aid the poor. As a matter of course, the majority of the aid workers that I talked to told me about some kind of help that they offered to their domestic staff outside of the fee-for-services employment relationship. When I asked if the domestic worker had children, I routinely got an answer similar to that of Alain, who works for a French NGO fighting famine. He said, she does, so we help out. One of her kids is in France, so we pay for his tuition. From paying school fees for children to paying for literacy classes, cooking classes, vocational training of many kinds, many aid workers were engaged in a project of improving the lives of their domestic workers. They vastly preferred this kind of engagement, giving money for a specific project, to direct handouts, which caused employers acute discomfort and concern for their own exploitation. And this was something that came up all the time in my interviews, was a concern that they were being exploited by the domestic workers, ironically, right? This was constantly brought up in various ways. So expat aid workers routinely position themselves not just as the patron, the French for boss, of their domestic workers, but as the patron as well, contributing beneficently and on their own terms to the causes in the lives of their workers that spoke to them personally. Fiona, who worked for a large international religious charity, was preparing to leave Dakar when I met her and was contemplating what role she would play in the life of her house staff when she returned to Brussels. Throughout her time in Senegal, she had taken seriously the responsibility she felt that she and her husband had as patrons, giving life and financial advice to her staff, as well as running a tight ship in the home to teach them about work ethic and responsibility. She told me she had played a guiding role in her nanny, Florence's life in particular, providing advice and counsel, as well as loans or monetary gifts towards certain expenses that Fiona believed were good investments. Fiona disapproved of Florence and her husband's choice to use their savings to buy a piece of land outside the city of Dakar, where they could afford it. Fiona described this land as out in the middle of nowhere and thought it was an impractical choice given that there was no possibility of finding domestic work with expats in its peri-urban location. So she opted against contributing to its purchase, telling me, we could have, but that she and her husband did not help with the project because they thought it was so ill-considered. They did, however, want to continue to invest in Florence's gifted daughter, who Fiona described as really bright, like really bright. Fiona expressed appreciative approval of Florence's commitment to finding the best schools for her children. She said to me, education is the big thing because she sees our education, you know. Fiona believed that she and her husband had inspired Florence with how education had shaped their own lives, and she felt education was the best avenue for investing resources in Florence after they left. She brought up one of the programs of the large religious humanitarian organization that she works for. We have child sponsorship programs. We have all sorts all over the world. So if it were within our means, then that's something I would consider. Fiona framed her desire to support Florence's effort to advance her daughter's education as a parallel to her development agency's famous child sponsorship program. She put herself in the role of the developer and her nanny in the role of target population or beneficiary. This was a distortion, or at least a very partial perception of what their relationship is based on, which is the employment relationship where Florence provides salaried caring labor for Fiona's family. That Fiona saw her role in Florence's life as a benefactor and advisor gave Fiona the opportunity to feel even more power and esteem from her relationship with Florence, in addition to extracting her reproductive labor at a very low wage. Like Fiona, who took her development agency as a model for how to engage with her house staff, Tamara used programming from her agency in relating to her first household employee as well. Tamara, an international NGO worker from the Balkans, said her housekeeper had been asking for loans, including just days after being paid her salary. For Tamara, this suggested not that the salary was far too low to cover her housekeeper's living expenses, but that the housekeeper needed Tamara to teach her how to manage money. I said, you need some financial service training. So I sat with her and I said, what are your bills? When are they due? When you get paid at the start of the month, maybe no one ever told you, you need to plan for your water bill, your electricity bill. Pay that first, set aside the rest. Tamara laughed, saying to me, I was bringing some of our programming work that we do in the village to help her. Tamara described this effort to educate her employee as empowering her housekeeper. Nancy, an American in her early 50s who worked in sustainable agriculture, paid her house staff not according to the value of their man hours, but according to her own philosophy of responsible giving. For example, when disclosing what she paid her housekeeper, of whom she said, I sort of see her like my daughter, she explained, what I do is I don't pay a really high salary. I pay $80,000. It's a small apartment, but then I give her money for other things. So roughly 105 pounds a month for 5 full days of work was certainly below the rate that most expats paid their staff, regardless of the size of the apartment. But Nancy preferred to give a low monthly salary and then say yes to various requests from her housekeeper that she felt were worthy, including covering medical bills for her housekeeper's daughter or paying for English language lessons in night school. Nancy was hesitant in explaining her reasons for this choice to me. I hate to say this, she said. It sounds so un-PC. But when the Senegalese staff I've had has a good sum of money, the majority of them are not responsible and don't know how to save money and can't save it. She recounted a story of her previous security guard, Abdu. She had given Abdu a substantial raise when she increased his duties to watering the garden and washing the dogs. Walking the dogs, well, maybe also washing the dogs, I don't know. And shortly thereafter, he disappeared. She found out that he had taken this new influx of cash and used it to migrate to Southern Africa, leaving Nancy without a security guard. She said, after that, I realized that giving big lump sums of money to somebody doesn't create the most responsible behavior. Nancy backtracked a bit from the statement, giving instead a cultural argument rather than an individual one for this employee's behavior. She said, I shouldn't say irresponsible and putting a judgment on it. The whole concept of being able to save money, when you have someone in your family that is needy, that really needs something, you're required to help, and you just can't save it. It's considered irresponsible if you do that. Another cultural aspect. So they're unable to save money because there's always somebody in the family that's going to need money. So for Nancy, it was the Senegalese population at large that could not be counted on to be responsible with their money. This attitude mirrors the way that aid dollars are often given not directly to governments, which are assumed to be full of corruption and self-interest, but funneled through NGOs, which are presumed to have only technocratic ideals and goals. Nancy's idea of how money should be used correctly, to be saved, not invested in family or personal networks or in economic migration, is here framed not as culturally American, but as responsible. When aid workers feel that they are acting as developers, as donors, as beneficent guides for their domestic staff, improving the lives and investing in their future well-being, they're able to ignore or dilute some of the potentially troubling aspects of their positions. Reframing the outside gifts or guidance as charitable, or even as a form of aid work, allows aid workers to disavow the morally suspect or commercial in nature aspects of their relationship with domestic workers and preserve a delicate psychological equilibrium. They are not simply paying someone to clean their bathrooms and drive their children around. They are providing a livelihood, contributing to a family, building the capacities of those who they thereby consider under their care as much as the other way around. Monetary gifts and paying medical bills get rebranded not as supplementing what is a very low wage for hard work in an expensive city, but as gestures of charity and care that reflect well on the giver. Development work is often framed as a matter of care. Aid workers, as well as the world at large, usually see their contribution as caring for the world's poor, as providing help and even aid, right there in the name. But care has never been a benignly positive or even value neutral force or instinct. Care itself can confirm or construct positions of superiority and inferiority, unintentionally or intentionally. Projects and regimes of caring often serve colonizing ends and can perpetuate or cement inequalities. As Michelle Murphy puts it, the stratigraphies of care, intimate relations, and labor have long legacies that thread through the very operation of European colonialism and American slavery, segregation, and empire. The origins of the development industry as an industry are firmly rooted in these entanglements, again, between care, intimate relations, and labor. In the post-war period of African colonialism, for just an example, there was a distinct term to focus rhetorically on the good works of colonialism. This period, referred to as welfare colonialism or even developmental colonialism, put a charitable face on imperialism, in part in response to growing criticism of colonialism in the metropole and in the colonies. A strategic rebranding focused on the benevolent projects of lifting people up, rather than on the realities of resource extraction and labor extraction, including military labor in the form of soldiers. In Africa and beyond, these humanitarian good works of empire were part of its very durable architecture and flowed neatly into the post-independence pivot to development interventions in the same places by the same architects. So in focusing on the relationship between development work and domestic work, I am similarly interested in the contemporary labor and resource extraction that a charitable face can obscure. My studies focus on the care work of local people for expatriates, aid workers, emphasizes not what aid brings to its supposed beneficiaries, but instead the reproductive labor of local people that upholds the international development industry and more broadly the development industry's work to uphold the status quo of a profoundly uneven global division of labor, mobility, and consumption. So as a conclusion, I want to note that it was especially European and American aid workers who felt this initial discomfort with having help in their home. Alma, the country director of a faith-based NGO who grew up in Latin America, didn't feel the same awkwardness as her US counterparts. She said, I'm from a developing country and having house helpers is normal. It's not a new thing to me and I don't have any mixed feelings about that, seriously. As long as we pay a salary that is fair and cover, the healthcare and everything, that's another job. For those who came from poorer countries and especially post-colonies, the very visible hierarchies of wealth that entitled professional people to hire poorer people to clean their homes was not something to be ashamed of or uncomfortable about, but merely a reality. Alain, the French NGO worker working against famine, said that his non-Western expat colleagues were the ones who broke him of his idea of trying not to have domestic help when in an overseas post. He said, I was talking to a friend of mine who grew up in Mumbai. She was like, I never understood the Western abhorrence of it because you're not doing anything by avoiding it. Doing your own laundry does nothing to reverse colonial power relations. Western expat aid workers have ambivalent feelings about their domestic staff. They feel obligated, they feel guilty. Having domestic help is awkward and frustrating and luxurious and essential all at once. They resent their help as much as they feel grateful for and dependent on them. It is never perfect. It is always more than you deserve and not the way you want it. The feelings of class and racial guilt are challenged by their feelings of vulnerability, as I describe elsewhere in the book, right? That this underlying feeling of vulnerability is really characterizes a lot of expat aid workers in the field. Two contradictory profiles emerge of the house staff, deceitful, but also victims in need of saving and financial assistance. We have so much, they have so little. Where is my change? Is he too lazy? Is she secretly wearing my hat when I'm not home? Various strategies are employed to reframe and deflect and absolve the discomfort that comes with hiring intimate laborers whose lives can be improved with the meagerest of wages to do tasks that you would normally do yourself for free. Many aid workers I spoke to were self-reflexive. and I know that the tone can be very arch, but I do want to highlight that these are not clueless parodies of colonial officers that are just going through the motions without any self-reflection at all. I mean, part of the point of this discomfort is that there is a lot of self-reflection going on, and that is very uncomfortable, right? Most of the aid workers I spoke to were self-reflexive, not only about their relations with the domestic staff, but about their role in Senegal in general and in the development industry more broadly. The vast majority entered the industry with a sincere desire to dedicate their effort and energy to making the world more equitable. After years in the development industry, however, they had a more modest understanding about their potential to make an impact on the persistent structures of inequity that shape the possibilities for sustainable change. The global status quo was stubborn and reinforced at every turn. Poor countries weren't really going to pull themselves out of poverty. They felt the discomfort between their daily paper pushing of the boulder up the hill and the acute and seemingly cemented need all around them. Just as doing one's own laundry does nothing to reverse colonial power relations, pushing back at the development industry's framing and limitations is unlikely to right a very large ship that is carried by the currents of neoliberal capital and a long history of global white supremacy. Besides, the laundry needs doing. Not taking a larger salary than local hires, not living in comfortable housing paid for by dollars earmarked for poverty reduction, not taking advantage of the market rates for care work wouldn't change the global power geometry. Would it? Thank you.
Wow, that was really, really amazing. You took us now into the world and the lives of these aid workers. And that was really both fascinating, but also like really new insights about them being economic migrants. But also, I think to me the greatest surprise in your talk was about how self-reflexive they are, because that's not something that I would imagine, because I'd be like, okay, like it's under the surface, but it's really good to hear that there is self-reflection, albeit shoved away with various strategies of coping with that discomfort. Okay, let's open the floor to a round of questions. I've got a couple, but I'll hold fire till everybody has had a chance. Anybody in the room, just if you can just put up your hand so I can know, and then anybody online, can you also just raise your hands, and then we can ask in turn. Okay, so I see Yeka, you, Meenakshi, all right. Okay, let's take a rapid fire of like sort of maybe 3 questions at a time. Is that all right?
Yeah, that's great.
And then we can open up the conversation. So over to you, Yeka. Oh yeah, sorry, Debbie will do the mics because.
Thanks. Thank you. That was fascinating and really thought-provoking as well for somebody who grew up the son of a development worker who I was raised by an au pair from Indonesia in Sweden, whilst my mother was working for WHO, going out to different countries. And later on, when she was living in Sri Lanka, and had domestic help, like all of the characters you've described more or less. Moving back to Geneva, she then brought one of the maids along with her. Anyway, so this is, of course, all of these debates have been had in our households many times. My own daughter is now a live-in au pair, like my au pair was, in Berlin. So she's an economic migrant from Brexit Britain, I suppose. And when I was young, or when I was a kid, my au pair from Indonesia, she was in a way an economic migrant to Sweden. And so I'm wondering that there must be a big literature about the au pair industry within Europe and elsewhere, which is obviously in some ways a flip side of, or a mirror image of this your framing, which is really interesting. So I'm wondering, have you been looking at that literature? What do the two kind of framings have a lot to inform each other on, if that makes sense? Sorry. Thank you very much. It was
Thank
really
you for that
fascinating.
question.
Can you just also introduce yourselves?
Oh, sorry.
So I'm Jörg Redström. I work on gender and masculinities at IDS.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Alistair Marklin from the Global Studies, lecturer in international relations. I study humanitarianism and kind of aid workers from a existentialist perspective. So I've just a short question on self-reflexivity. Do you get an idea were you able to capture those debates that were happening before your own intervention?
Great question.
Because obviously you are an intervener, an ethical intervener here, and then did you see effects from your own intervention in terms of stimulating these debates? And was there a difference post your intervention in terms of the conversation you had? And were you able to capture the conversations we had before that point? Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Great question. I want to ask something similar about ethics. I'm Tessa Lewin. I'm at the Institute of Development Studies, and I work on gender and sexuality mostly. And I was curious as to whether you had taken your book back to the field and just a little more on your own kind of personal relationships with those you studied, because you described a kind of 25-year kind of ethnographic trajectory. And so I wanted to know, what's happened post it being finished and what discussions you've had.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay, can we give Dinah a chance to respond and then let's
Sure.
other questions?
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for those questions. This is great. It gives me, again, since I've just finished a book on all of this, I've thought about all these things. So it's so nice that what I couldn't pack into the talk, I get a chance to connect with you about, except for au pairs, which is a really interesting question because there is not a big literature on it. In fact, it's very, very, very thin, and maybe is the next project that needs to be done by somebody. There's very little, again, this kind of thinking about it as economic migration almost doesn't exist. They're just left out altogether from studies of global mobility and migration. And it is labor migration, right? I think what does exist is really thin. And I haven't come across it actually. So maybe actually there is a trove of it that I never uncovered. But what's really interesting about the whole expatriate as migration thing is that one of the biggest places where you find information about expats in scholarly literature is in international human resources management literature. IHRM literature, which is something that Sarah Kunz's new book, Expatriate, really digs into. I'm so glad she did that work. I find it very dull to read those articles myself, but she really has mined it. And the thing that's interesting about that is the migration studies literature never looks at that. And it does not consider itself migration studies, right? And so in kind of putting those two into conversation, Sarah Kunz has come out with really interesting insights about how, about these kind of post-colonial blind spots and silences within migration studies, and the way that then this whole literature about expats, which we find in international human resources migration management literature, can kind of develop as though there has never been any discussion of post-coloniality or the way that these channels of mobility and power and privilege got formed. So it's really interesting. I really recommend her book, which just came out this year with University of Manchester Press. Yeah, but there's very little that's been written on au pairs that I've seen that substantially engages with any of these kinds of themes. One of my newer projects is about study abroad as migration, and thinking about the gendered and racial politics of study abroad, particularly in Africa, of American students kind of being dropped off to learn. And so I think, au pairs would be another kind of really, there's so much overlaps with all these other kinds of things, but there are also really interesting specificities with that type of thing, with that type of, as I'm sure your daughter is realizing too, she's encountering herself. I will also say that the Ayahs and Amas project is something that's going on here in the UK. It's a transnational network of scholars who work on the colonial migration of nannies, right, of Ayahs from India and from, South Asia in general, and Amas from East Asia that came back often to England with families of colonial officers, and about what happened to them and how they're tracking their movements. Of really great literature as well. And they have in London kind of found this house where Ayahs used to live, the Ayahs house in London, and they've made it a landmark with a little museum, and they're doing really interesting work. And again, I think the threads are there too in what your story of growing up with an au pair. And it's interesting to me that the words au pair were used for that? Were they at that time? It was, yeah, that's really interesting because that label is used selectively and in certain cases, and I think has a certain distinction and maybe chicness that nanny doesn't have. I don't know. I think there's something there to be discovered, but I don't know about it yet. So are all these debates happening before the nosy anthropologists come and ask about them? That's a great question. Yes and no. So the digital ethnography I did was in kind of aid worker online spaces, and there are groups like Aid Mamas, right, where aid worker women who have children give advice about, how can I get the polio vaccine for my kid when we're in Madagascar, or like what's the best toddler crib that can be on safari, whatever the questions are, discussions of nannies and maids and hiring and firing domestic staff happen all the time in these kind of online spaces. And they're often very fraught. And there's a lot of debate in them too about what is the proper way to do this. There's no code of ethics for any of this. The organizations themselves almost never talk to their staff about the politics and the ethics of engaging with local people as your employees when you're doing in your home. I mean, that's totally absent. And yet there's water cooler talk, of course, about, oh, I think I have to fire my maid, right? She's wearing my hat, right? So there were those kinds of discussions for sure. And also, I will say though, that when I was talking to the aid workers, they were often really thrilled to have a chance to talk out some of this discomfort and the self-reflexivity. I'm so glad someone's talking about this. I'm so glad someone's writing about this. I'm so glad you asked me that question because here's what I'm thinking. And often they would ask me, this is what I'm paying. Is that normal? Is that what others are paying? Or do you think, should I get them gifts? And should it be for Ramadan because they're Muslim? Or should it be for Christmas because I'm Christian? Like when should I get, asking me for codes. They're very hungry for protocols on how to deal with this, right? Because they don't exist, right? So I found there was a lot of hunger to talk about this. And that partly talks to your question, Tessa, too. I haven't yet, it just came out a couple months ago, so I haven't yet had the chance to bring the book. Also, it's such a transitory population that most of the aid workers I talked to posted between 2016 and 2019 are no longer in Senegal. They're in Myanmar and Tanzania and Papua New Guinea, right? So there isn't really a there to take it back to, except for the domestic workers. Who had much less interest in my project, to be totally honest. They politely answered my questions, but did not think of this as something that was very interesting to talk about, except for the very micro dynamics of, yeah, it pays better than working for a local family, right? So that is interesting in its own right. Yeah, but that said, giving this book talk, it's very interesting to see who asks what questions, and I won't say in a public online forum, but it's been very interesting to have the reaction that people who are involved with aid, either as researchers or as practitioners, have had to dismissing this as important, or being like, oh, thank goodness this is, or I never thought about this before at all, ever. And I'm so glad someone is thinking about it. So there's been a mixed response. And a lot of anthropologists who are eager to say, yes, the aid workers are terrible and we're wonderful. Whereas, of course, these dynamics exist with scholars and researchers in the field too. And that's also an important aspect of this.
Great, thank you. Okay, next round, Meenakshi.
Hi, thanks, Diana. This was really fascinating, and also loved your expressive and humorous style of engaging and writing. I have two questions, if I may take the liberty. So one is around the role of local social norms, because some of the examples you picked were like the developing country people who came as expats didn't feel as conflicted about hiring domestic workers. I come from India, and I have domestic workers in my home in India, but now that I'm a sort of expat here in the UK, I do all my cooking and cleaning myself. So there is a social cultural norm that operates in a country, and how have you factored that in, which might also govern what an expat ends up having to do in order to live in a different country, because the context provides this as a requirement. And the other question I had was on the wages and the labor market, because you've used the term extractive In one, the context that it's not paying a living wage,
Uh-huh.
which very few industries anyway are paying. Secondly, it's also based on an assumption that our domestic work is something that we must do for free ourselves, which is again a very Western assumption, I would say. A lot of our care cannot be taken care of by just the individuals in the home, which is mostly the woman. So, and then you said that, you know, some of your domestic work interviewees said it's better than working for a local family, which means they are getting more than a fair wage they would otherwise get. So there is a norm of wages in the labor market, which you can't rock just because you're an expat with a development agency and are trying to, you know, or could you? So I'd like to hear your view on that. Yeah, yeah, thank you.
Great.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm going to echo Meenakshi here with the sort of, it was really nice to hear you talk about the way you were. So I come from Pakistan. My name's Rabab, and I've largely worked on donor projects, and a lot of times it's like my colleagues from the donor agency asking me for recommendations, and I'm generally not very comfortable with that. But at the same time, I wanted to ask you sort of these. One of my questions is, because you mentioned like a lot of the people that you had interviewed had now moved on to other places. Did you come across certain domestic workers who had been from one person to, who had gone from working for one person to another person, and how had they, what was the difference in sort of their negotiation when they were negotiating with someone like another person that they from the international aid sort of world? The other one I had was around how were they being recruited? Was it like, for instance, in Pakistan, for instance, local workers are not seen as like, they're not trusted. And so what,
They're not trusted?
yeah, they're
Okay.
not. So what ends up happening is like people at higher levels, they end up hiring workers from the Philippines instead.
Yeah.
So local workers end up getting sidelined. Did you see that sort of phenomena in the work that you were doing? And how were they generally being recruited? Was it through an agency, which then adds, at least in Pakistan, it adds like another layer of exploitation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Can I answer those two? Because those are both
Yes,
multi-part
really
questions.
great. Yeah,
Yeah.
yes, that would be great, Dinah. I'm just like, if anybody online has a question, just raise your hands and I will come to you after this round. Over to you, Dinah.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you. This is so much to engage with. Thank you very much for these great multi-layer questions. Yeah, local social norms. So in some ways, the local context was Senegal, but in many ways, the local context for the expats was Aidlandia, right? Well, the kind of aid archipelago where there are kind of these norms that travel among the community. So both of those were influencing, I would say, these aid workers. And certainly, people's choices were impacted by social pressure within the aid circle to hire people, right? There were circulating rumors about a Canadian diplomat family where the wife did all the domestic work instead of them hiring someone. And this was talked about with an air of scandal as well of, you know, first of all, the regressive gender dynamics in that couple, you know, was part of the idea of scandal, which like, you know, outsourced it to another woman and therefore the gender powers dynamics are gone. I don't anyway, but also that why wouldn't they have this huge Canadian embassy house? You know, why wouldn't they pay? That's an income for somebody. How dare they deny that person, right? And again, so there was pressure, and this French colleague whose Indian colleague said, you know, why are you not just getting someone to do your laundry, dude? You're not really changing the world by doing your own laundry. So again, there were kind of pressures from within, not only to have domestic help, but also to keep the payment within a very certain range, right? So this kind of question about the market dynamics. This one woman said that she was very surprised when a new person in her office, a new expat, had just come to Senegal and asked around, what do you pay your housekeeper? We're about to hire somebody and I just want to know what the norms are. And there were different norms. And the people got very angry in this discussion, not that people were paying low wages, but that of the people who were paying too much. You know, that what are you doing? You're ruining the market, right? Then you leave and what's going to happen? Right, so it's better if you're not paying them a lot, and then you know, again, it's your question of, is this a real concern that you're ruining the market by inflating it? I know, I think it's a big open question in some ways. And there is certainly a consensus that working for aid workers is a better job, right? That not only do they have better hours, they have higher pay, they tend to be easier homes to work in because they're Western washing machines, dishwashers, vacuum cleaners, things that a local family might not have. And so it's considered easier work, right? Less grueling and hard on the body. So there are ways in which the domestic workers I talked to had, and the employers, the aid worker employers would all say, well, it's better than working for a local family. And and there, among Senegalese professional women, there is some debate among them as well about what a fair wage is, and being a good employer to your domestic workers, having one for a long time, signals that you treat them well. And there, among professional Senegalese women, there is some kind of changing discourse around what it means to be a fair boss. I think that's emerging more and more, and I don't know how that's going to affect the market, but that is something that's being talked about. I do want to get back to the domestic work as something women should be doing for free kind of aspect of this, because I think that's super interesting. But let me just say, in terms of recruitment, there are agencies that are middlemen agencies, but brokers in Senegal, but very few, and they tend not to work, and aid workers skip them. And you'll see advice, that even people who might have used such agencies in Thailand, for example, won't use them in Dakar because they've gotten advice that they are fraudulent and that they kind of say this person has worked for expat families, but then they show up and clearly haven't, those kinds of things. So recruitment happens in a few different ways. One is that there are all these classified ads that aid workers themselves post about their domestic staff before they leave for their next country, which are really interesting. And I kind of dug into as a trove of information about norms and expectations for these jobs and the gender differences between them too. And there's a whole chapter about that in the book explicitly, but it's really interesting to read what qualities are worth highlighting as potential features. And some of them were specialized skills that domestic workers get from working with expat families explicitly. So, for example, makes great banana bread, or, knows how to starch my husband's collars, right? Or whatever, these kinds of, for maids and then for nannies, it was things like, is great at Lego, and or asked questions and taught my son some French, and right, these kinds of things about educational play, right? No CPR, right? Because the US Embassy provides hygiene and CPR classes for domestic workers, which is really interesting, hygiene especially. And then for security guards and gardeners and things, that were all these qualities that were about kindness, honest, friendly, does a gardener need to be kind? But it was clear that there were these kinds of very gendered ideas about what you might be expecting, but what this Senegalese man is actually going to bring. And a big one for all of these male jobs, which tend to be in the periphery of the house, where it loves dogs. And there were often photos accompanying these classified ads of a Senegalese man smiling with a dog. Right, so really interesting to read through these ads what the expectations that you might want to be relieved about, and for both men and women. And in terms of local workers being silent, it was really this classification of having worked for expats before was very important to people, because you had a shorthand. You didn't have to explain, no, we don't do it like that, we do it like this, or there, just some kind of expectation that they weren't starting from zero, more so than local people. But there were ethnic divisions. A really interesting thing that's a little bit of inside baseball, but I think is really interesting about Senegal is that a huge percentage of the aid workers, domestic workers, were from the Casamance, which is the southern region of Senegal, which tends to be very Catholic. Senegal is 95% Muslim, and so many of the domestic workers for aid worker families were Catholic. And this is partly about migration chains from the Catholic regions of the country, the Serra regions and the Casamance regions, like rural migration to work as care workers is common in these regions, but it was also something that most of the aid workers themselves didn't know until I pointed out, oh yeah, I guess she is Catholic, or I guess I never really thought about how like, so are all my friends' names, right? They all have French names rather than, Muslim names, right? So, it wasn't something acknowledged. A couple of French aid workers did tell me they explicitly wanted Catholic domestic workers because they've cooked pork. One woman said that she was uncomfortable with people wearing veils in her home because what is that teaching her daughters, right? A French, because the differences in different nations' discourses in terms of aid worker host countries was very interesting. But when I pointed out, some people hadn't made the connection that where their rural migrant aid worker was from until I pointed it out. So it's interesting what the preference is, who gets excluded from the markets in different ways is really an interesting one. But it tends not to be that I wouldn't want someone who was raised in Dakar. That tends not to be one of the explicitly stated preferences. And then, no, I certainly don't mean to be, I think one of the things that ties this project together, right, is that both the domestic workers and the aid workers are coming from countries that don't adequately provide for care as a reality of our lives and as a need, and as something that should be baked into the understanding of human unit that they have caring responsibilities, right? So a lot of the rural migrant aid domestic workers were leaving their children behind in the village area to do that, so that the aid workers could bring their children to the fields, right? Because and we could argue about, do the aid agencies provide for care in giving these inflated salaries? Not explicitly and not with any clear directives of how that money is supposed to be used, right? Which seems like a no-brainer to me that NGOs could do. But no, I certainly didn't mean to imply, when I say that women could be doing for themselves for free, I just mean that they're called upon to do for themselves for free in these other spaces. And so often the discourse, and maybe as expert on masculinity would have noticed, I don't talk much about men in this particular presentation. I do a lot more in the book, but so often there was the assumption that for women to be able to lean into their careers, they needed other women to fill in for the domestic work, not their partners, not their male partners. And that was just the blanket expectation. Yeah. Even people who were there to do gender and development and, rethinking, they just was outside the.
Great. Yes, please, of course. And then anybody online? Could I just ask?
Yeah.
You are there, so Jay, and then I'll come to you. Sorry, 1 second. Let me just see if there's anyone online. There's nobody online. Okay, over to you, please.
Thank you very much for this briefing. My name is Omar, and I'm a student at IDS doing my master's in development studies.
Okay.
I came from Syria and I work for the humanitarian sector for years, and I am still working there. I have two reflections rather than questions to your, to the presentation that you provided, which is I think they are online. The first one is when the international aid worker are coming, normally they are coming with the benefits because of under the international package, whereas normally especially in those developing countries or the fragile settings, the local staff, they don't have the same benefit. And I can recall an experience. I worked for several international organization when a senior manager director took 6-month maternity leave, but she wasn't allowing the maternity leave for the local staff because just know that they are not covered, they shouldn't be. And then it was the everyday conversation of everyone, how an international organization, they are not allowing this and they are not finding solution for this.
Yeah.
And the second one, during the earthquake that hit Turkey and Syria recently, international organization staff, they get huge benefit as a kind of an allowance or subsidy for what happened, whereas the locals and the local organization, they couldn't do it. And when they were communicating with the international organization, they said, simply you don't have the policy to cover you. As if they were prepared for the disasters, as if they were coming to say, oh, earthquake, don't come now, come later, because we need to develop the policy. So, and then this is becoming, okay, are you working for this, or can I work for this? And then this becoming a big politics and big question. So we just wanted to provide those reflections, and thank you.
Thank you.
Great, yes, and we were talking about the discrepancy between local and international.
Yeah, I wondered
staff,
if that
and
was
then
gonna be one of your
respective care
questions.
arrangements over lunch.
Yeah.
So that's a great comment and question.
Thank you. I'm actually really happy that you are doing this research because it is really interesting, and it's in my long-term plan of research where looking at the ethics of humanitarian workers and how that impacts their professional work is where I'm kind of thinking about in the future. And so this is an aspect that I've also experienced as an aid worker myself that I was very uncomfortable about. So it's really good that there are conversations already going on there. I had one, okay, it was two different questions. One, you sort of answered, but it was like, well, what did the domestic workers have to say about all of this? And it was really interesting how you said, well, they didn't really want to talk about it. And I was like, of course, because it's a trade secret. There's power involved in who actually gets the job and what kind of job involves. And you, as a white researcher, will probably not have the direct access to some of that. I thought about that because, and I know that the context that you were mentioning seems more like it's a capital city issue, but in the field offices where I worked at, having a job gets you the job for all of your relatives and all of your friends, because there's no referral mechanisms, there's no objective way of recruitment. So when we had one cook, she referred the housekeeper, the driver, everyone. So she has so much power in that village. So, like, did you notice in your data any themes about power structures that are being driven by the expats who, through these recruitment procedures was the one long question. And the second question was, you mentioned about these crossovers between what is regarded as a personal recruitment and personal life versus their professional work and the discrepancy between that. And I was wondering, because this is something that I'm sort of looking into in the future as well, did you see any way of those crossing over leading to changes, in sort of maybe an action research kind of a form where, all these reflections are really great. Where is that leading to, especially in the professional work that they're doing? So
Great. Thank you. Great questions.
Great. Can I just throw mine in? And this is much more sort of, following on from what Meenakshi talked about, social norms. And I'm just wondering, out of your 35 respondents, you spoke a lot about like women, but I was wondering how many of the women actually were expat workers themselves, and how many of those were wives of expat men who had gone there, and then the dynamics between, because, like even in, at least in local cultures, men don't hire domestic workers, women hire domestic workers, men just kind of like carry on because it's like the woman's responsibility. So then she kind of like hires other people to take care of that. And I'm just wondering, the extent to which that was reflected in your data. But also I'm still thinking about what, like the migration bit, because in the project that I'm running, which is SUPA, which is hosting this, is basically we're working with domestic workers in India, where domestic workers themselves are very strong, have very strong chains and migration patterns into the city, and also therefore I suppose limitations and constraints that puts them more at risk because they are not local, but they are migrant. Whereas the aid worker is a migrant, but then the migration comes with that much power. So migration, two different types of migration, two very different, one that puts domestic workers incredibly at risk because, they're migrant workers and then they're shunned by the local population and they're kind of like told to go away, etc., or told to keep quiet. They cannot raise their voice against low wages because otherwise the landlord will, eject them from the property or whatever. Right. Whereas the aid workers, which have so much power. So what are those dynamics of those different patterns of migration?
Great, thank you. Oh gosh, where to begin? Okay, so I'll go in order. So thank you, for those great comments. I think the perks of an international package versus local stuff. I mean, it's so absurd, right? And I was saying to Deep at lunch too that there's this great researcher from University of Edinburgh, Ishbel McWah-Herman, who has done all these studies of the disparities between local salary, and packages and things like that, and expat salaries, and what effects those actually have on psychological effects, right, on worker productivity and staff integration, and then how that actually interrupts, the flow of information that could help implementation be more effective, all these kinds of things. And it's really important stuff. And she started an organization called Project FAIR, where they actually she reflects back, brings this data to aid organizations who are shocked. The reaction is that we had no idea, right? And you're kind of like, what? How could you have had no idea? But then of course they want to address this issue now that they're made aware of it. So when of course the local staff is like, hello, we could have told you that on day one, we all know this, right? We live with this. I mean, and there's so many examples. I mean, as better than anyone, there's so many examples of this too, of being that the security of foreign staff is something that a great deal of time and money and energy is put into, and the security of local staff is good luck, right? All these kinds of dynamics which are just absurd. What I also find, and I'm sure you could attest to this, and this also gets to Deep's first question too, is that a lot of the trailing spouses ended up getting local jobs, hired on local positions that don't have these huge packages because they don't need them, because the spouse they're trailing already has these packages, right? And so again, more money earmarked for this country goes into the pockets, right? I'm sure they compete very favorable with actual locals for these jobs because of the hierarchies of education and citizenship and all these skills that are really easy for people with certain passports to acquire that are very difficult for local people to acquire, right? So, so that is one thing, is that a lot of, so to answer your question, just pivoting, everyone I interviewed for the aid worker side were working for aid organizations. So all of them were aid workers. That said, some of them were trailing spouses who easily got a job in the aid industry, right? We see these dynamics all the time on the ground, that anyone who shows up with a white face often can get jobs especially in post-crisis situations and things like that. So that was often people who had no training or background in anything technical or related to development, landed plum local hire jobs with these organizations that then often led to international jobs with these same organizations in ways that get interrupted for actual local staff, right? The ethics and the impact on the work is such a great question. Thank you. I'm so glad you're also going to do work on this, because I think it's so interesting. And I will tell you that I started this project hoping that this book would be about how the interactions with sometimes the closest interactions that anyone has with local people when they are expat development workers are the people they employ to work in their homes, right? And so my imagination of this project was, I'll figure out the secret way in which this affects policy and its implementation, right? They have a shorthand right in the house. They've arrived fresh off the boat from, let's say, Papua New Guinea to Senegal. Oh, I can just ask Miriam, my maid, so how does gender work here? What's the deal with the scar? All these kind of cultural questions. And I found none of that happening actually in this way that was almost absurd, right? To the extent that when I asked domestic workers what kinds of development projects were their bosses doing, they had zero information. In fact, it would never occur to them to ask that it had any relevancy for their lives at all. It had never occurred to their employers to tell them or to engage them about the issues that they were working on. None. It never happened. And even, to the extent, and this was part of a larger pattern, that the domestic workers didn't see that development itself. We talked a lot about what is development and what are they doing here, them as a broad category, not just your employers. And they had no interest. They didn't see it as relevant to their lives at all. The only thing that development had brought them was the opportunity to clean the floors of expat families for a better wage than they could get for cleaning the floors for local people, period, right? Or the possibility of going with the family that they work for to the next post. So James Ferguson talks about this kind of change in Africa of African citizens thinking about development as this really big potential towards someday building towards a future that would be where livelihoods would be more possible, to a kind of a real reduction in the past 30 years of even thinking of that as something that development was going to bring, and that migration had all but replaced it as like the hope for a better future. And so he says not progress, but egress being what people were hoping for. And I really found that with the domestic workers I interviewed. You know, I would say, in your village that you left for economic migration, are there development projects happening there? And they say, oh yeah, there's some white people projects there. You know, they call them Tubab projects, like Projet Tubab, white people project. Oh yeah, there's some. They built a hospital maybe or something. But it just like the idea that that was leading towards them being able to stay with their families in the village was like totally not at all part of it. And some domestic workers I talked to, I was the one who said that they're development workers you're working for, because they're like, oh, I knew they were connected to an embassy, right? But I didn't realize, you know, it just was totally irrelevant to them. So, and for the aid workers that I asked, oh, do you ever ask her, like, well, they're like, no, we have local staff who deal with local things in our office, right? Their jobs were so disconnected from needing local knowledge, which was part of the disillusionment I found from them. You know, a lot of them had worked closer to the ground in other kinds of ways before landing this plum expat job. And so they had kind of imagined that they would be there with a shovel and, you know, surrounded by children, you know, digging wells or whatever. And their jobs were really about, you know, going over USAID budgets with a fine-tooth comb in air-conditioned offices with colleagues who speak the local language that they can't even overhear to know what's going on in politics of the country that they're standing in. Right, they were so disconnected from that reality that they never needed to ask their nannies or maids for anything because it wasn't relevant to the jobs they were being asked to do. So I know it's a kind of a buzzkill of an answer, but yeah, so I really hoped that that would be, and I mean, the extent that these things are divorced, I think the best way to say it, which is also a kind of, yeah, thinking about the professional versus personal life, I met with the IOM Senegal's officer on domestic workers' rights. And I said, I'm doing this project about domestic workers. She's Senegalese. And I said, could we meet and talk and have coffee? And she said, of course. And we met, and she told me that, she told me all about the programs they're doing to bring Senegalese domestic workers home from the Middle East, especially where they're, you know, had their human rights abuses and exploitation, where they were barred from returning because their passport had been taken, you know, all these kinds of different things. So I listened with great interest. And then I said, so actually I'm interested in expat aid workers here in Senegal. Like, do your colleagues have formal contracts with their domestic workers, your expat colleagues? And she was like, I would never ask them. And I said, so do they pay like above? Then she's like, I would never ask them what they pay, right? So even the domestic rights, you know, domestic workers' rights official would never, you know, like the idea would never occur to her to ask her, that's private. I said, you know, so this is the disconnect I'm talking about again here, unfortunately. And I did, so your question about access to the domestic workers in interviews and what would they tell me as a white woman versus, you know, so of course, I had easier, you know, I think the aid workers saw me as contemporary, as someone who, you know, had traveled the same routes and gone to the same institutions for education and things like that. I was also, you know, a working mother and professional balancing family life. So certainly we had instant rapport. You know, I was house sitting without, you know, they didn't ask for any background or credential to like invite me into their homes. Their security guards waved me in without even knowing that I was, you know, all these ways in which I had access to that community. That was very easy. But also I had my best friend in Senegal when I lived there for dissertation work. My roommate was a Senegalese domestic worker for American families. And so through her, I had this whole network of domestic workers too. I also speak Wolof fairly fluently. And so I didn't recruit them through their bosses, if you know what I mean. So I wasn't an emissary of the expat community asking them for their experiences in that way. And so, of course, I can never totally erase all the baggage that comes with my identity, as none of us can as researchers, but they, you know, we had lovely open conversations and I was starting from a place of, you know, more I'm interested about you and your life, and more than I'm here to report back on how your job satisfaction to your employer or something like that. And so we did have long open conversations about their work and about their migration history and their work as women and the daily negotiating of domestic work itself and their understanding of what their employers were wanting from them, and how they were referring their friends and family to these positions too. Yeah, when I was talking about recruitment, so part of it, there aren't brokers, there are these classified ads, but then another way is that, oh, well, you know, there's this process of what they call inheriting domestic workers too, which is like a really interesting language. But people would say, well, I'm leaving Dakar, why don't you take my housekeeper? Or, oh, I worked in Dakar 7 years ago, let's look up like Sochna, my nanny, and see if she's free right now, because she could be your, you know, there was these kind of connections. There was a lot of inheriting, but also that people's housekeepers would say, when the neighbor is looking for, do you know someone who could work for, you know, Stephen's house next door? Oh yeah, well, let me ask my sister if she'll come. And so people were brought in through friends and through family members into working for expats, which again was seen as a better job than working for local families. How did I do in covering the questions?
Brilliant.
Okay.
Okay, great. Any more questions, comments, Debbie? No? You're like, because I saw you kind of like going like, oh. Yeah, great. Okay, people online, last chance to raise your hands. Okay. No worries. Great. Thank you so much. This has provided.
Thank you
so
so much for
food
coming and
thought.
asking such wonderful questions. I really appreciate it.
Really, really great. Thank you.
Thank you.